I also want to give a quick shout out to Punch Perfect Boxing. His breakdowns are always top notch. He's truly a master at analyzing some of these fights coming out of Japan.
And we are live. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Punch Perfect Boxing channel. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today, I'm going to be doing my Punch Perfect preview for David Morrell taking on IMAM KHATAEV over 10 rounds this Saturday in New York as part of a massive Riyadh season card. My preview for all the other fights are now available on the channel, so please go and check them out. Although I left this till last, it's not because I think it's the worst fight of the bunch. It's definitely the one I'm most confident in picking a winner in. I just feel really confident in one of these guys in this matchup, but I'll explain as the video goes on. But I think a lot of people are really excited by this fight because it's two big punchers. And I think what's really exciting about it is that it just came out of left field. It came out of nowhere. You know, this isn't setting up for a world title shot. It's not a final eliminator. It's not a fight that they were on a collision course for. It's the fact that David Morrell's kind of gone to the very top and just fallen short against David Benavidez. And IMAM KHATAEV's on his way up and he's exciting. He's fun. He punches hard, coming off a bit of a bad performance, arguably the worst of his pro career to date. And it just makes sense sometimes to roll the dice and throw two exciting fighters that can punch in with each other. And this feels like very much Turkey Al Sheikh matchmaking. It feels like Riyadh season matchmaking. Fights that you don't necessarily have in your head, but he makes them because he sees one guy that's good, another guy that's good, one guy that's exciting, another guy that's exciting, and thinks, let's just match him. It doesn't matter if one of them's trying to rebuild to a world title shot, one of them's trying to get to a title shot. Let's just put them in with each other because it's fun. So I like this matchup. It really came out of left field, but I think it's going to be exciting on Saturday night and it will kickstart the card nicely. In terms of how I think it will play out, I'll get into that as I go through the video, but I think it's always good to provide some perspective on both fighters, as I always do. Again, this is just my opinions on each fighter. I'll give you some facts about each of them as well, but for the most part, this is just my opinion on each fighter and how I think the fight will play out. I'll start with IMAM KHATAEV because if you don't know a great deal about him, he had a very good amateur career. You know, an Olympic bronze and a world bronze shouldn't be sniffed at. The one thing I will say is after winning Olympic bronze and getting beat in the semis by Ben Whittaker, I did feel that at the Worlds in 2023, I would have liked to have seen him go all the way. I think off the back of, you know, the Olympics, a couple of the fighters at his weight class deciding to turn pro meant that the field was a little bit weaker and he had an opportunity in 2023 to really go for that gold medal and ultimately he wasn't able to capture it. But listen, a bronze medal at both of the two major amateur tournaments, you know, shouldn't be sniffed at and it's an incredible accomplishment. And he was a very good amateur. He had an interesting career. You know, he had some defeats along the way that were a little bit surprising, but he also had some massive victories. The victory I always go back to was his win over Julio Cesar La Cruz in Russia in the World Series of Boxing. Now, you might look at that on BoxRec and go, in Russia against someone as great as Julio Cesar La Cruz, arguably the greatest amateur of his lifetime. You know, that sounds like it was dodgy. I actually don't think it was a robbery. I think if you watch the fight, Julio Cesar La Cruz was far too comfortable boxing the way he does, which sometimes is a bit too nonchalant, sometimes not producing enough work. And KHATAEV, I thought, was really switched on. He didn't just try and bulldoze him like some people tried to do with La Cruz, and it just makes La Cruz look even better because it's easier for him to evade those type of opponents. But KHATAEV actually picked his counters quite nicely. And whilst I got to the end of the fight and thought, Cruz probably gets this, the fact that KHATAEV got it wasn't all that surprising to me. And I think he was genuinely happy with his performance. Artur Beterbiev was in the ring to kind of congratulate him afterwards as well. So it was a massive victory. I think people look at it and go, robbery, because it was in Russia and it was against the great Julio Cesar La Cruz. But it was legitimately a competitive fight. And I thought KHATAEV went about his business really smartly in that fight as well and the way he performed. So he has a win over Julio Cesar La Cruz in the World Series of Boxing. And he also has two wins, one in the amateur, one in an IBA pro event against Arlen Lopez. That fight it felt like they were on a collision course at the Olympics, and ultimately we didn't get to see the fight. And we eventually saw it in 2023, and he emerged a narrow winner over Arlen Lopez, who had won gold at Tokyo 2020. And then they decided that they wanted to run it back in a bit more of a pro format in an IBA pro event over 5 rounds, and KHATAEV made it 2-0. And Arlen Lopez is one of the greatest amateurs of his generation as well, you know, Olympic champion at 2 weight classes. So impressive from KHATAEV. They were competitive fights, don't get me wrong. I feel like Arlen Lopez probably thought that he could have won either of those. But Katiev, especially in the IBA Pro event, I think it was definitely more suited to him. Arlen Lopez is tricky as an amateur, but over more rounds, I felt that Katiev was able to get the better of him. I also think what plays into that is the fact it's an IBA event. I'm not saying that it was necessarily corrupt or anything like that, but the testing's a little bit different. Katiev looked incredibly strong versus how he looked against Lopez in the amateurs. So I think that plays a factor. But I think the thing was with Katiev is when he turned pro, I think many of us thought he's got the potential to be the next Artur Beterbiev. You make the obvious comparisons. He's Russian. He's a bit menacing looking. He punches incredibly hard. In the amateurs, especially at the Olympics, he won 2 fights by stoppages. The knockout that he produced in the quarterfinals was especially impressive. Against Shalidov was really impressive. But against Ben Whittaker, who had a bad shoulder, he got outboxed quite comfortably. Ben Whittaker found it really easy to just run for 3 rounds with one arm and win the fight. And that for me was a little bit like, okay, Katiev's gone down a little bit in my estimations. Is he a puncher that can be outboxed quite easily? But then again, the amateurs is 3 rounds. You've got to be switched on and concentrated for 3 rounds. And if you can run for 3 rounds like Whittaker did, you're going to have success. You can't do that for 12 rounds or 10 rounds or 8 rounds as a pro. So it doesn't really matter what happens when you do eventually turn over. So Katiev showed some real highs in the amateurs, but also some disappointing results at the Olympics and the Worlds when I think he could have potentially gone on one step further to, compete for gold. As a pro, he's been okay. He had some impressive performances early when he wiped out Ricards Bolotniks, who I think the matchmaking there is just perfect. Bolotniks isn't going to go the distance with Katiev, but he's a name. He's known as a gatekeeper. He's a good opponent to have on the record when you're, not even 10 fights deep into your pro career. But it was always going to be a matchup that looked good for Katiev, and he was always going to look good in, and he was going to win in pretty spectacular fashion. So you've got Bolotniks on the resume. His last fight is what raises some eyebrows and some suspicions against Derville Palacio. He didn't look particularly good. He looked a bit sort of laboursome. It ended up going to a points decision. It was a bit frustrating to watch. I think many people would have lumped on him to win by KO because he'd become a KO artist, but he was just really frustrating and disappointing to watch. So there's been some real highs and there's been some lows with Katiev, both as an amateur and as a pro. And we're sort of waiting to kind of see that consistency from him or really discover how good he is. But I think the one thing he'll take some confidence in heading into this weekend is that he does well against Cubans, albeit in more of an amateur format. But the greatest, some of the greatest Cubans of his generation were Julio Cesar La Cruz and Arlen Lopez, and he beat them both. So he'll take confidence in the fact that whilst David Morrell was viewed as a very good Cuban fighter, he'll feel like he can, get the better of him this weekend. So Katiev's a good fighter. I think he's still a prospect at this stage. I don't quite see him as a contender just yet. But I wouldn't rule him out in this fight. I'm going to get into why I think he ultimately loses, and I'm quite confident in him losing. But if he won, it wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world, just because he hasn't quite lived up to expectations, in his previous fight or sometimes in the amateurs as well. Moving on to David Morrell, one of my favourite fighters in the sport. I just love watching him. He's so athletic. He's so skilled. He's got the good blend of skills and athleticism. He reminds me a little bit of Boots Ennis in that sense, that he's got the athleticism of a top athlete, but has also got the skills of a top fighter as well. He's obviously coming off a defeat to David Benavidez. And to me, he doesn't go down in my estimations for that. This is the type of matchmaking we need to see more in boxing. It should be 2 fighters that are kind of on the cusp of big things. David Benavidez had obviously been at the top level. He was on a decent run with the win over Caleb Plant, Demetrius Andrade, Alexander Vosdik. He's on a really good world level run at that stage, Benavidez. Morrell wasn't quite there. It was more kind of fringe guys that Morrell had beaten up until that point. But when you make matchups like that, people sort of talk about them as high risk. It should really be low risk and high reward. If you lose, so what? You equipped yourself well, you took a dangerous fight, and it doesn't matter that you've got a defeat on the record. You went up against David Benavidez, who's been viewed as one of the best up-and-coming fighters in the sport for a long time, and is now viewed as one of the best fighters in the sport. Many people view him as kind of the heir to the Bivol and Beterbiev throne. So I loved the matchmaking. I loved that he got in there with Benavidez and ultimately just came up short. But he gave Benavidez all he could handle. He scored a knockdown. He had a point taken, but he gave Benavidez real trouble. My prediction for that fight that I did on Patreon at the time, I didn't do one on YouTube, but it was on Patreon, was that I felt that Benavidez was going to win on points just purely because I thought his offense was a little bit better than Morrell's. I think Morrell was a little bit more skilled and more athletic, but Benavidez